So, you have tuppence. May I be permitted to see it?
No, I wanted to feed the birds.
Fiddlesticks, boy. Feed the birds, and what have you got? Fat birds. But if you invest your tuppence wisely in the bank, safe and sound, soon that tuppence, safely invested in the bank, will compound. Welcome to our joyful family of investors.
Give it back! Give me back the money!
Michael, behave! Michael, behave! Jane!
Give me back my money! Give me back my money!
There's something wrong. The bank won't give someone their money.
Well, I'm going to get mine. Come along, young man.
Every penny in there. And mine too.
And give me mine, too. Stop all payments! Stop all payments! Stop those children! Jane! Michael! Stop those children! Stop those children!
Okay, well, welcome to the world of financial panics. This little clip probably just teaches you as much as...
Here, we're off a mouth.
Leave her alone! Leave her alone!
Easy now.
That's for next class. So the financial panics have a very long history. And this is just one little episode from Mary Poppins. The subtitles were in Greek, as you noticed, and that I assume is because there was particular interest in Greece about financial crashes and bank runs, recently. So I think this little episode just gives us a hint about a couple of features of financial systems. One is the inherent fragility of financial systems, and the inherent fragility of financial systems arises from the fact that what banks are engaged in is a process that we call maturity transformation, which is that they borrow short term, but they lend long term. So that's the main service that they provide. They borrow from us, depositors, and then in principle they loan to investors and productive enterprises, and that's typically on a longer term basis. And what that means is they're always short on liquidity, which is that if all of us went to the bank and demanded our deposits back, the bank actually doesn't have those deposits on hand. They've all been lent. And it's very costly to to demand all of its loans back from the investors, which is actually sort of essentially what happens during periods of financial crisis, which is when everybody's trying to deleverage. But in normal times, of course, as you just saw in that clip, the bank actually doesn't have that cash on hand. And that could, easily cause a kind of a bank run or a bank panic, where essentially people do not know whether the fundamental reason that they're not getting their money back is because of simply illiquidity or insolvency. Those are two very different things. Banks are always illiquid, but they need not be insolvent as long as, of course, the money that they have on lent is expected to get back. Now, these financial panics, sort of one essential point is the inherent fragility of financial systems. And second is that, of course, when there are these bank runs, they are extremely costly for the real economy because the response to these panics is a drying up of credit, because nobody wants to lend anymore because they want to essentially increase their liquidity. And that what that means is that the process of building up debt is in turn now played in reverse, a process that we call deleveraging, when nobody wants to lend, so credit dries up, the real economy suffers, and this is extremely costly to the real economy. And because these financial crises have occurred with regular frequency in economic history, that there have been a lot of different ways of trying to prevent at least the frequency or severity of these crises. And the modern way of doing that is essentially by the state acting as a lender of last resort, and the state in the form of a central bank. And what the central bank does is basically provide a kind of a blanket guarantee that if there is a run on banks, so if all of us are going to Harvard Square and trying to withdraw our money from Citizens Bank, Citizens Bank doesn't have all that cash on hand. Citizens Bank can actually borrow from the Federal Reserve of Boston, which in turn borrows from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, and they can make that available, cash available to the depositors. So the lender of last resort is the bank, is the central bank or the state. However, the presence of a lender of last resort in turn creates what we call moral hazard, which is that if there is a lender that's willing to cover any withdrawal of deposits, sudden unexpected withdrawal of deposits from banks, then what is there to guarantee that banks in fact lend reasonably, responsibly, and therefore and moral hazard is what we call when banks or anybody else behaves irresponsibly with other people's money because they think that they might be essentially bailed out. And so from the very get-go, we have bank regulation, or the need for bank supervision and regulation, in the picture right there and then. So anytime you're providing a lender of last resort function, you have to couple that with a regulatory function that the central bank essentially offers a two-way deal to banks that it provides a lender of last resort function to. It says, I'm willing to provide you with liquidity when you need it, but in return, you will allow me to regulate you, to supervise you and regulate you, to ensure what? To ensure that you're not taking excessive risks, to ensure that you're not too leveraged, to ensure that you have capital, adequate capital at hand. The inherent fragility of banks and financial systems has created, from its very nature, a kind of intermingling of the financial system with the state. The financial system needs the state to ensure that panics are not frequent, and then the state has to regulate the financial system in order to ensure that moral hazard remains within bounds. So finance and government are necessarily entangled, when you look at, even when you look at the financial system from the very narrowest of perspectives, which is look at the financial system from it in terms of its undertaking, its most immediate function, which is to to borrow short and lend long. If you think about the financial system, as I think we would like to think in this context and in our discussion, as institutions that provide, in fact, even a broader social purpose, that is, for example, in the context of developing countries, assisting in productive transformation, in the context of advanced countries, assisting in closing the gap between what we've called the vanguard and the rear guard. In both cases, the structural transformation process, then in fact, finance has to serve many, many other purposes on top. And that's going to also require us to think about what is the appropriate relationship between the financial system and the government. What I want to do in my introductory comments is just go over quickly some facts in the run-up to the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, 2009. Talk a little bit about the circumstances that brought it along. I'm less interested in getting the details of the financial crisis, and you all have a version of it, and the readings go through it as well. But I'm more interested in emphasizing a kind of a cautionary tale that, with hindsight, it seems fairly clear all the mistakes that we made in the run-up to the financial crisis. But I want you also to get a flavor of, how at the time it may not have been that obvious. It might actually have looked like the financial system was doing something that we wanted to do, which is serve social purpose, and that there were many elements of the story that seems to justify and motivate that this was something that was desirable rather than undesirable. And that cautionary tale, I think, is something I'd like you to keep in mind as we broaden our discussion here about the role of finance, not simply in terms of prevention of crisis, but in terms of this positive role of how it can assist in the process of structural transformation, in particular this kind of inclusion, of an inclusionary growth process in the context of the knowledge economy, that if we're going to be imposing certain requirements on what we want finance to accomplish, we will need to be very careful about, our stories about what we can ask finance to do without creating also problems of excessive leverage, problems of instability, problems of eventual financial crises. So these are some pictures that show you the growth of the financial sector in the United States, financial industry, the rise in financial industry profits, the share of finance in the U.S. economy, the volume of trading, of stock trading, different indicators of the role of finance, and pretty much all of them show you a very rapid increase in the run-up to the financial crisis. In some cases, in the aftermath of the financial crisis, these trend lines have come down, although not to the levels that really prevailed in the 80s and early 1990s. So just a relatively small reversal. With respect to sort of cross-border finance, and that's sort of one of the aspects that I want to emphasize of this period of financial expansion, we see, the most telling picture with respect to the growth of both foreign assets and foreign liabilities in the United States. So this is essentially the two-way flow of finance in the run-up to the financial crisis. So you can see both the positives, foreign assets, and the negatives, the foreign liabilities, growing. And the difference, of course, is the net foreign asset position. But this is basically a flow. So if in any year you have a larger negative number than a positive number. That means that in that year, the United States was running a current account deficit or a capital account surplus, that more money was coming in. That is, the United States was a net borrower from the rest of the world. And that, of course, mainly took the form of foreigners buying U.S. securities, U.S. Treasury securities. In certain parts of the world, this growth of the financial sector took rather extreme form. Two countries, Iceland and Ireland, essentially in particular. This is a picture that shows the ratio of now whenever you look at these things, you always have to keep stocks and flows apart. So you have to be very clear about whether you're talking about stocks or flows. This is actually the ratio of a stock to a flow. So the stock is the total volume of foreign assets and liabilities is a ratio of the flow of GDP. GDP is a flow measure. So if you look at the Ireland, you see that essentially the stock of assets and liabilities is a share of GDP, or the stock of assets and liabilities were a sort of multiple of 16 of GDP, right? Sort of it's sort of, or in the case of Iceland, stock of liabilities were a stock multiple of 10. So people often talked about how Iceland had turned itself into a hedge fund as a country, essentially just being hugely leveraged. And here, I mean, sort of at some level, the proximate cause of the financial crisis is a kind of a fatal combination between two things. One is the process of financial globalization, which greatly increases two-way capital flows across national borders, and a process of financial deregulation within economies. That within economies, that finance becomes a lot freer. What does that mean? It means essentially the traditional distinction between commercial and investment banking disappears. So the banks are no longer just like what you saw in that clip from Mary Poppins, which is that they just borrow and lend to investors, but they will now also engage in investment banking, which is that they actually sort of borrow also to not just in terms of deposits, but they issue securities. They trade on their own account, which is that they actually speculate in financial markets themselves. Freedom of international capital mobility really became a norm relatively late in the post-war period. It's really in the early 1990s that it became a norm. That, in fact, the original Bretton Woods regime, as instituted at the end of the Second World War, with the International Monetary Fund at its center, had enshrined capital controls as sort of the expected norm. That Keynes famously had said that he thought that capital controls was required for the functioning of the international economy, and this wasn't just a temporary expedient. It was supposed to be the sort of a permanent feature of the system to ensure stability of international economy, and also to ensure that domestic economic management, what today we call Keynesian macroeconomic management, wasn't overwhelmed by sort of the volume of international short-term capital flows coming in and out, and determining interest rates and other financial aggregates in ways that the domestic macroeconomic policymakers couldn't control them. We moved to a regime where essentially, rather than directly regulate banks, especially big banks were allowed to run their own risk models and do essentially their own regulation. And probably one of the sort of the most dangerous things that happened in this period was the rise of what's called a shadow banking system. So the main difference between the shadow banking system and the actual banking system is the actual banking system operates under this explicit quid pro quo, which I said earlier, was that you basically, they depend on the state's lender of last resort function, and in return, they are regulated. Whereas the shadow banking system essentially operates outside that system and is not directly regulated and is not in principle covered by the government's lender of last resort function. The idea there is that, original idea was that sophisticated investors know what they're doing, so that they can be sufficiently discerning about the riskiness of different financial institutions in that shadow banking system because they're financially sophisticated, and therefore they will discriminate between those that are engaged in risky behavior, that are overly leveraged, overly indebted, and will not put their money with them, and will prefer those that are more sound, that the government doesn't need to do anything about those. And that if those fail, that they could fail, and the government could say, you just failed, just like any other private entity. Why should I back you up? Because they were not supposed to affect the integrity of the overall banking and financial system. Of course, this was the assumption that proved wrong, given that, in fact, so much of there was so much intermingling between the formal banking, between the actual regulated banking system and the shadow banking system. This, by the way, is a kind of a problem that has now become quite global. It's one of the problems that plagues the Chinese financial system today, where the growth of the shadow financial system has become one of the worrying aspects of the Chinese system. Okay? And then finally, of course, the rise in the level of innovation of the financial system. These sort of, the alphabet soup of various kinds of new products, the CDOs, the CDSs, and that offered sort of, in principle, had the benefit that they allowed risk and return to be divvied up in a number of different ways and provide very customized menus of assets to different kinds of investors, but turned out to have very distinct problems. Historically, we know that this sort of, with respect to financial globalization, that it sort of has always been correlated with greater incidence of banking crises. So if you in this chart, sort of there's you superimpose two things. One is sort of a chart of the level of financial globalization, capital mobility, how mobile is capital, and the other is an incidence of banking crises. How frequent were banking crises, and then these two align with it themselves. Okay? So the question again, becomes, in many ways, after the fact, looking back, it's not that difficult to tell a story about the kinds of risks that were being taken, but the question is, what were we thinking, or what were people who sort of allowed this process to go? What were they thinking? And in principle, I think both of these processes, the process of financial globalization and the process of domestic financial regulation, they were rooted in a particular narrative about how beneficial these processes were going to be. With respect to financial globalization, it was transferring savings from the rich countries to poor countries, right? And therefore spurring overall investment and growth. That's how the push for capital account liberalization and capital mobility was justified, was motivated by saying, look, all these rich countries have a lot of saving, but they don't have that much investment opportunities. The poor countries have all these investment opportunities, but they're poor, they don't have much saving. So wouldn't it be wonderful if we allowed capital to move? And in this story, of course, capital would move from the rich countries to the poor countries. Didn't quite work out that way. With respect to financial deregulation, the main economic argument was that that would allow a better allocation of risk, a better distribution of risk. Therefore, but financial innovation and the creation of new financial products and the entry of new lenders, new types of financial intermediaries would enable a better distribution of risk and reward, that people could allocate themselves. You want safe assets, you can have safe assets. But you want risky assets, you can have risky assets. And the benefit of having risky assets is that it makes money available to borrowers that would not otherwise have. Or afterwards, if you think about a lot of the activities of the new economy, right? New technologies, those are highly risky activities. So you need to have financial markets that are going to providing finance for these kinds of new risky activities. So again, in principle, having sort of financial innovation allows the ability to generate finance for these kinds of activities. Now, of course, with respect to the story of this crisis, is really not about sort of lending to high-tech companies that went bust. It was about lending for mortgages, for housing. But there, too, as I'll come to in a second, there was a social purpose. That is, getting more people to actually have access to own their own homes, to be able to buy their homes. And that was actually the premise and the appeal of this process of financial development and financial innovation, was that it was going to allow much greater access to home ownership, much greater access to credit, would democratize the mortgage market. Okay? So who wouldn't want that? Who wouldn't want greater access to mortgages, especially for lower income people? So we start by essentially allowing much greater sort of greater competition, so that in the old days you basically had two local banks, and you go to one and again to go to the other. If those two local banks didn't give you any money, you were stuck. And those two banks played it very safe. They would look at your income, and they look at whether you have a stable job, you're a pillar of your community or not. And if you didn't, you couldn't check the boxes, then you wouldn't get the money. Okay, so it was a restrictive system. What about opening it up systems so that more people can actually have mortgage loans? And then what you do is, in order to encourage more lending, you enable new types of mortgage instruments. And so you create new mortgage categories so that some non-conventional borrowers can be helped. And the way to do that is you enable these mortgages to be pooled and packaged into securities that in turn can be sold to investors. What were the old banks doing? The old banks were simply lending you money, and then they were holding that loan on their books. And they, month after month, they hoped that you would come back and pay back the interest and capital back to them. But it was on their books. With this new system, what you could do is make a loan and immediately package those loans, and others, of course, would buy that loan from you, would combine it with loans from other parts of the country, turn it into a security, and then market that security. And then people who would buy those securities actually didn't know whose loans and whose houses they were actually lending to. All they knew was that they were buying a security and that they had a right to a payment. That was in turn backed up by the interest payments that were being paid on these mortgage loans. In principle, that was a lot more safer, right? A lot less risk, because before, when you had your local bank, if the factory went bust in the town, then there were a lot of people who lost their jobs, a lot of people who had their incomes went down, a lot of people couldn't pay their service, and that meant that the local bank would have to go bust. Because it was a local bank that was holding all these loans. But if you could simply combine all these mortgage securities and distribute them across a wide range of people, then, if you were holding one of these instruments, maybe some of the, a tiny share may have been, from the town where the factory went, when the factory closed, and it really wouldn't affect you because it's just a very small share of the instrument. So. And then you can even do more financial engineering with it. You can divvy up these payments into different kinds of tranches, and have different levels of seniority, and which would mean that the more senior you are, the safer it would be. And then you could even add sort of an additional layer of security, which is to actually have credit risk rating agencies come and certify that these were, that the bulk of these were actually AAA, that they were safe. And then you could have not just regular investors, but also institutional investors, pension funds and insurance companies invest in it. And then, get another layer of security. You could then create sort of financial instruments that were called, credit default swaps, that these were derivatives that essentially allowed you to purchase insurance against them, so that if you're holding a lot of these mortgage-based instruments, these CDOs, and you thought something might go wrong with them, you could actually purchase insurance in case they did. And so all the systems seemed like, it was really, when you look at it, it was kind of a pyramid of debt, as this picture says. You had, basically a multi-trillion-dollar sort of financial house built on essentially a $600 billion sort of quantity of what's called subprime mortgages. That these were sort of mortgages that didn't check the traditional criteria. So this did result in a large increase in lending to housing. And in fact, some of the people who promoted this process weren't just the financial institutions. There were also a lot of community agencies, because they saw a lot of people who would not ordinarily have access to mortgage loans have access. And so people who sort of organizations and NGOs and civil society organizations that are supposed to represent the interests of lower income borrowers actually were pretty excited about this. And you can see some of this effect, that home prices began to rise quite rapidly. And just looking at a picture like this, and of course one of the critics and one of the Cassandras of this, probably the most prominent, was Bob Schiller, who looked at this picture and says, this doesn't look normal. This doesn't look like something that's going to be sustained. And he said that there was a bubble and that it would eventually burst. But as in as in happens in a lot of these processes, and the answer was, you don't understand, we're in a completely different world where traditional relationships don't hold anymore. The traditional correlations are very misleading. Why? Well, because we have this financial engineering. We know a lot more about risk and how to distribute it. We have this financial innovation, and we're in a different world, and therefore the history of these relationships don't actually matter. And then, of course, then you get into the debt spiral. The debt spiral is a process where everything is in reverse, except that a process that took years now essentially takes days or months, and that compression causes a lot of the real economic cost. You have reduction in housing prices as the bubble begins to burst. A reduction in housing prices, in turn, is causing defaults on mortgages, because a lot of these loans were based on expectation that the housing prices would increase. So you give somebody a loan, even if you don't think they have the capacity to repay the loan. As an institution, you don't care about that, because as long as housing prices keep increasing, you can always repossess the house and sell it at a higher price. And so you actually haven't incurred a cost, even if you don't think that the owner has a capacity to repay. Actually, you don't care at all about whether the owner has capacity to repay or not, as long as housing prices are increasing, because you can also always repossess the house and resell at a higher price. But in a context where housing prices begin to fall, this is no longer possible. So mortgage default rates increase. The values of these CDOs, this sort of package of securities that are backed by mortgages, and the values of those begin to go down, and therefore that means that all the lending that is taking place in the economy, backed up by that collateral, now suffers a loss in confidence. That means that essentially anybody who is up for short-term borrowing, anybody who needs liquidity from the market and therefore normally showed up collateral using these kinds of assets is now cut off from the market because of the decline in the value of these collateralizing assets. And now what you need to do, if you cannot borrow short-term, you just need to, again, the only way you can raise money is by selling stuff that you have. But that only makes the things worse because by selling these CDOs in order to raise cash, you're only contributing to the fall in the price of the CDO. So that's where the death spiral comes in. And so that you get this process of freezing where nobody wants to touch anything related to CDOs and the mortgage markets and related assets because all of that is now tainted with this problem of confidence. And the only thing that people will touch are the safest assets. And typically the safest assets are government securities. That's for, sort of then, that's the only thing that people will actually want to hold and forget about sort of being able to raise money for investment and so forth. So, we can obviously sort of in this process, again, going back, you can blame the unscrupulous mortgage lenders who devised these subprime mortgages, lent people who had no capacity to pay, and sort of these financial institutions who leveraged themselves to the hilt so that they could actually have more resources to issue more of these mortgages. The credit rating agencies that presumably fell asleep on the job and just sort of very high credit ratings to these CDOs on the basis of historical correlations that proved after the fact quite misleading. And of course, the failure of the regulators. In here, because sort of Alan Greenspan's famous statement was that he basically stood up in front of Congress and said, "I believed in the self-regulating market, that essentially that these people had the right incentives, because if they failed, they would fail, and therefore they had the right incentive to act in prudent ways." And he said his confidence had been shaken in self-regulating markets. So if you want to sort of move somehow sort of one step deeper and ask sort of what are some of the the causes of the crisis, at some level this had to do with these narratives, with these ideas that that we convinced ourselves that things that after the fact look very dangerous during the process look not dangerous, but look like actually desirable things to do. So the notion of market efficiency. Now it's interesting that Bob Shiller eventually won the Nobel Prize in economics, and one of the other economists who won the Nobel Prize with him is the father of efficient markets. And it was Eugene Fama from the University of Chicago. And he's famous for the efficient market hypothesis, which says that essentially financial markets appropriately distill all the relevant information. And they are efficient in the sense that all the information that is required to price assets over time are distilled and efficiently used by markets, and therefore that they're efficient in the sense that you couldn't actually make them work better by regulating them, by intervening, by price regulation or other kinds of regulation. And that was the dominant story. So I say, before the crisis, there was a lot of Fama, but not enough Shiller, because Shiller believed in that markets often were not efficient. For example, that they were excessively volatile, they were susceptible to bubbles, as in the kinds of housing runs. There was also a prevailing narrative, to some extent, that it still prevails, about the inefficacy of government regulation. The reason that the prevailing mode of regulation went from sort of traditional regulation to one which essentially left the job of regulation to the big banks themselves was the idea that governments were always going to be behind markets. They were always going to be behind financial innovation. They could never keep track. And therefore, it was better not to try. It was better just to leave the job to the big banks, who, after all, had a stake in ensuring that they were profitable, and therefore they would act in a way that would minimize the chances of bank runs and financial panics. So this is the quote from Greenspan. I made a mistake in presuming that the self-interest of organizations, specifically banks and others, were such that they were best capable of protecting their own shareholders and their equity in firms. And then sort of, I think we can discuss the role and the culpability of economists and their ideas in this. But the curious thing about really the role of economics is that, just as the example of Schiller illustrates, the problem wasn't that the economics literature focused only on efficient markets. Efficient markets was one take, but there was a lot of other analyses in economics that pointed in many different ways. There was a very long literature on emerging market financial crises, which, after all, turns out to have been a pretty good guide as to what happened in the advanced countries eventually. There was very large literature on agency theory, which suggested precisely that the kind of a belief that Alan Greenspan had would not work out. After all, what did Greenspan say? That he presumed that banks were best situated to protect their own shareholders' interests. Okay? The whole point about agency theory, that there's a difference in the interest of the principal and the agent. Here, the principal is the equity holder, the agent is the bank manager, right? That there was always going to be a difference in the interest of those, and that you have to be very careful about what the managers and the way that they were going to act and the risks that they were going to take in the presence of differences in this principal agent. So that was the whole point of agency theory. Asymmetric information, the literature on financial market bubbles, which I referred to already. The literature on bank runs is very old. It goes, sort of even before the literature, there was Mary Poppins. And the notion about sort of, systemic risk behavior. So all these things were actually in the literature. These aren't concepts that were developed after the global financial crisis. So from the standpoint of ideas and theories and hypotheses and narratives within the economics profession, the curious thing is not that we didn't know these things. The curious thing is why is it that only one of these frameworks, the efficient market hypothesis, is the one that essentially with respect to financial regulation, the one that economists gravitated to. Okay. The second kind of sort of broad causal story here would have to do about the role of vested interests, so that this wasn't really about stories we told ourselves. This was just about naked self-interest. It was that there were groups in particular that wanted this to happen. So I think in your readings, I think this view is most clearly represented by Simon Johnson. And here is sort of a version of the capture thesis, is that essentially that banks were a particularly important special interest that captured the state and the regulators. And so what we got was a sort of policies that advanced banks' interest. That was because the significant amount of resources that banks had to contribute to campaigns, to contribute to lobbying, and of course, what Simon Johnson emphasizes, the revolving door, that Goldman Sachs executives moving from Wall Street to Washington. Okay? And not only that this revolving door and the financial capture ensures that Washington, D.C. pursues the policies that are more in line with the profitability and the profit of banks is that when you get the crisis, in the aftermath of the crisis, then you get the problem that the response to the crisis takes a form that is differentially advantageous to the banks themselves. The intellectual justification of that becomes a too big to fail argument, that you cannot let these big banks fail because the systemic cost would be so large, and therefore you really have, you have no choice but to actually bail them out. And so you have this curious dichotomy that many of the borrowers, the people who actually borrowed using subprime mortgages, found themselves in very difficult economic situations because they were not bailed out. Whereas the banks themselves, who were, if you will, the other side of this sort of risk-taking, the big banks were essentially bailed out. The other strand of thinking about how sort of the role of interests contributed to this process is the argument that Raghu Rajan has made. And this is the argument that now connects with our earlier discussion about inequality. That in the Rajan thesis is that this process of inequality had the unintended consequence that the state and the government, unable to compensate the middle and lower middle classes through better jobs, better better wages, and more progressive taxation, essentially chose to sustain their borrowing by making loans cheaper and more available. And of course, that meant loosening up regulatory standards. So that essentially cheap housing finance was the way that you bought off people in a context of rising inequality. So that was the, and if that story is true, it's interesting that then the rise in populism after the global financial crisis becomes then the political route, the political reaction to this inequality once the compensation through the financial system becomes no longer feasible because of the global financial crisis. Okay, so I'll end with these sort of very broad questions that we want to focus on about the sort of, how will we discern what is the appropriate role? What is it that we want from the financial system? Do we simply want a financial system that's not going to cause us headaches? That's one vision, that you just want financial stability. If you want a financial stability, you're going to have a very narrow banking system that engages only in traditional kind of banking, commercial banking, right? That will mean a relatively thin financial system, but you don't expect too much from that. Now, if you want the financial system to engage in other kinds of activities, serve other goals, then you'll have to think in terms of more instruments. You'll have to think in terms of financial innovation. And inevitably, there will be greater financial instability associated with more financial innovation. So how much financial innovation do you want to have to achieve other social goals as a price of achieving those goals, even though it'll come at the cost of reducing financial stability? When we say we want finance to serve the real economy, what do we actually mean by that? Is finance, different from any other sector? Should it have a kind of social or public purpose that's explicitly defined that we wanted to pursue? And then how do we distinguish? I mean, perhaps to me the most intriguing and difficult question that the global financial crisis poses is really the one about, how do we distinguish sort of the bogus narratives from the good ones? Right? Because we can discuss here all kinds of things. We want finance to be in the service of the new economy, in generating greater inclusion and closing the gap between the vanguard and the rear guard. How do we differentiate that from a process of financial expansion that's actually going to be precisely the cause for the next kind of a crisis, right? If you will go back to the, sort of the dot-com bubble and the role that finance played in that, and the failures of SNLs and other financial institutions engaged in such finance. So these are sort of figuring out what's a valid narrative and a somewhat bogus narrative that's going to expose us to financial risks down the line. It's actually not that easy, not that straightforward. And I think that's sort of one of the lessons of the global financial crisis. So let me just stop here. Just get maybe just a couple of questions if there are any. Otherwise, we'll move to Roberto. Yeah.
What is the international take on seeing finance then as public good, or like having state-owned banks that do even like this basic finance stuff? For example, in Germany, we have the KfW, which is giving out loans to individuals and companies like a bank, but it's totally state-owned.
Yes. So Germany is, I think, probably the sort of the most important developed country where there's a public investment bank that engages in that. And in a lot of middle-income countries, that model was initially pursued in the 50s and 60s, but now has gone sort of then died as a consequence of the crises of the 80s and 90s. So public development banking completely disappeared in the emerging markets. And only recently is sort of the idea is a little bit coming back. I don't know. Roberto might say something about BNDES, which is the Brazilian version of this, which is a huge development bank, but is now explicitly being cut down to size by the current government. So that's sort of like the KfW model in Germany. But this is one of the things that actually we want to talk about. Sort of that obviously Germany is an example of how you can have a banking system that's actually very different, where you have significant segment that's publicly owned for long-term finance, and that in many other respects, the financial system in Germany also looks very different in terms of the market capitalization of the German stock exchange, for example. It's a tiny fraction of the one that's in the United States. So stock exchanges, sort of the stock market plays a very little role in Germany compared to that in the United States, yet obviously without any immediate cost to sort of investment in Germany compared to the United States. So there's then Germany suggests maybe that difference between the German system of finance and the United States, or the Anglo-Saxon or the Anglo-American one, suggests that maybe that's not the full range that is possible, that you might actually have even greater variability within, outside the range that we currently observe. So those are, I think, all the reasons for us to sort of to engage in sort of more imaginative thinking about what's possible and feasible within financial systems.
Two quick questions. The first one is on the role of politics, because I think it's very convincing how you talk about the ideas and interests, but where do political actors come in here? Did they have any sort of choice? Could they have said, okay, I'm not buying into this narrative? What would your comment be on that part? And the second one is, if we take seriously what we saw in the last lecture on inequality and what you have been showing us here on the rise of finance, why should we have any hope on that system changing at all? Because, I mean, it's not only changing, like, the rise of finance has consequences in in economic terms, but it also has consequences for the sort of political process. And why should we have any hope of these things change if we see that actors who have an interest in the status quo become even more powerful?
Yeah. So let me start from your second question. I think that's a very good question. So let me rephrase it. So if in other words, everything it's a kind of a very deterministic picture. That is that, we live in a world where the structure of vested interests is such that there's very little we can do, essentially. We can, talk amongst ourselves here, and we can exercise our institutional imagination, but the fact is that outcomes are always going to be determined by these interests that are very strong, in particular, let's say, the interest of Wall Street, and they'll always get what they want. Now, I think that's why sort of my pushback on that is to say that, where is it, where does Wall Street get the idea of where their interest is? So in other words, this is, when we talk about these vested interests, we often, forget that, interest is an idea too. That, sort of banks, decide what the regulators should do or what they ought to be doing based on a conception of what is actually in their interest. And that conception is part of the narrative. So in other words, I don't think it was the case that banks push for heavy deregulation, or for that matter, that banks engaged in such high levels of leveraging, or engage in such degrees of financial innovation, that they would have thought it's actually in their self-interest to do so had they understood that they were precipitating something like the 2008-2009 crisis. In other words, they were operating under false consciousness too. So they actually, turns out after the fact, you can say maybe they were pursuing their short-term interests. You can still, come up with a story that's sort of, essentially it's all about interest. But a lot of that interest was also defined by the fact that, they had bought into the same kind of efficient market view of financial markets as, that economists or some economists were preaching. So, from that perspective, it was really much more about ideas than just about interest. So I think our contribution, and I think the way that there is an opening here is in terms of these narratives that I think what people believe is going to happen, how the world works, what's feasible, what's not feasible, and what are the objectives that they ought to pursue, I think are all up for grabs. They can all be discussed, and they're and they are generated. They're not simply, people are not born with these things, and so there's a lot more, I think, fluidity if you think about sort of how self-interest is defined and how they're defined by prevailing narratives and conceptions about what works, what doesn't work, and how the world works. And that's where I think we have, an ability to get in and say, for example, look, you think that this is the only way a financial system can work, but look at, Germany. It's a very different financial system. Look at Japan, look at France, look at Finland. It's a very different kind of system. So I think, that's a possibility that we have, that, of redefining interests. And ultimately, I think if you could convince people that a financial system that's so large, that has such influence in Washington, D.C., is producing negative effects, then I think, we live in a democracy. I think people eventually also will vote against that idea. So one of the things about this populism that for example, the whole Trump phenomenon that I find a little bit difficult to understand, especially in light of the financial crisis, is how little of this has bounced back on the financial institutions. We have had we have a reaction against the trade regime, but we haven't had really a popular reaction against the financial regime, and that's a little bit harder for me to understand. But it's like maybe it's a matter of time. I suggest, I'm sure there are sort of, a lot of these questions are sort of general questions that I think, we may want to come back to. So unless there was something specific about something I said specifically that's not part of the broader discussion, I would suggest that let's turn to you, Roberto, and then
So I will divide my remarks into two parts. First, I want to make general comments about the nature of crisis, of economic crisis, or instability, and the role of finance in crisis. And second, I want to speak to the lessons to be learned from the financial and economic crisis of 2007 to 2009. So first, the crisis in general. It is a wonderful subject because one of the ways that we have to understand how an economy works and how it can change is to address its periodic breakdown. Now, I propose first a general view, and the general view is that there are two fundamental recurrent reasons for economic crisis. The first and most basic reason of all lies surprisingly in the most central economic phenomenon, the relation of supply to demand. And it is the failure of spontaneous equivalence between breakthroughs in the supply constraints on economic growth and breakthroughs in the demand constraints. These breakthroughs on either side are discontinuous. They have different characters. They are hierarchically ordered. And a breakthrough on one side of supply or of demand does not automatically generate a breakthrough on the other side. So if you consider first the demand side of the economy, at one pole of the spectrum of ways of breaking through the constraints, the demand constraints on economic growth, is simply expanding credit and debt without any change in the underlying distribution of economic advantage and opportunity. At the opposite pole of the spectrum is a set of institutional innovations that influence and broaden access to economic opportunities and educational capabilities. And by that means, influence the primary distribution of economic advantage. This is a much more long-lasting and far-reaching way to break through the constraints on demand. Now consider the supply constraints on economic growth. At one pole of the spectrum, a model firm simply waits for new demand before investing or expanding output. It does not innovate, it does not build up inventory, it simply responds to new demand when it appears. At the opposite pole of the spectrum is what the literature of the business schools calls disruptive innovation. Capital-intensive innovation that not simply changes the form of production, but also helps to create new demands, new customers in new markets, and operates in this way on both the demand and the supply side in the micro world of the firm. Now, what happens in economic growth is that an advance in one of these spectrums does not automatically produce an advance on the other. And so there is a fundamental tendency to disequilibrium or lack of equivalence in the economy. And that, to my mind, is the most profound source of recurrent economic instability in economic life. The two spectrums meet at the end. So if we, for example, return to our discussion of an inclusive form of the knowledge economy, the widespread dissemination and deepening of the most advanced practice of production, there we have the example of an advance that is simultaneously on the demand and the supply side of the economy. But that is not the normal state in economic life, and therefore the economy has a permanent susceptibility to these failures of equivalence. Keynes's theory of depression or breakdown could be seen as the theory of a special case. Just one variant of these failures of equivalence, a variant characterized by the violation of Say's law that supply ensures its own demand. A variant in which the rigidity of a particular price, the price of labor, plays a special role. It wasn't a general theory of these failures of equivalence. So far as I can tell, we have no such general theory. Now, the second reason for economic instability has to do with the relation of finance to the real economy. Finance has a troubled relation to the real economy, and instability in finance, if it rises beyond a certain threshold, then begins to harm real economic activity. The conventional way of thinking about the problems that finance can create is the following. The view is that if the capital markets is perfectly competitive, it will by definition allocate resources to their most efficient use. If there is a failure in competition, including a failure in the access to information, then the failure should be corrected. And insofar as it is not corrected, or while it is not corrected, there should be a localized regulatory response to the localized market failure. The second major way of thinking about the problems of finance has been the way suggested by Keynes and his disciples, and it emphasizes that liquid capital, by its very liquidity, by virtue of its very liquidity, becomes a vehicle for the psychological cycles of elation and despondency, greed and fear, which then produce financial crisis that can in turn contaminate real economic activity. It's a kind of radicalization of the psychological tendencies, the psychological emphasis of English political economy. What these two conventional ways of thinking exclude is precisely what I want to emphasize, which is that different economic institutions can either tighten or loosen the link between finance and the real economy. The looser the relation, the greater the danger that finance poses to the real economy. Finance can grow in size, it can absorb more resources, more profits, more talent in the society. It can suffer a phenomenon of hypertrophy, and yet it can be loosened, unanchored from real economic activity. And in this situation, it threatens to become a bad master rather than a good servant. Different economic institutions differ in the extent to which they enlist finance in the service of the productive agenda of society. The two conventional ways of thinking that I have described fail to elucidate three central enigmas of financial activity in these contemporary economies. The first enigma is that the production system under the arrangements of these economies is largely self-financed on the basis of the retained and reinvested earnings of private firms. Empirical research has suggested that well over 80% of the funding of production is internally generated within the production system itself. This simple observation then leads to a disquieting question. What then is the point of all of that money in the banks and the stock markets? It has an episodic or oblique relation to the funding of production. For example, through initial public offerings or by establishing a benchmark of values that supposedly helps the firms borrow from the banks, but for the most part, in fact, they don't borrow. The second enigma has to do with the asymmetrical relation of finance to the real economy in the following sense. In good times, finance is largely indifferent to the real economy, and in bad times, it becomes destructive. The third enigma is that the financial activity that in theory should be the most important to the mission of finance which is the funding of the production of new assets, and in particular the funding of the production of new assets in new ways, is in fact a minuscule part of total financial activity, as in venture capital, which even in the economies in which it is most established, the United States and Israel, is a very small part of total financial activity. I suggest that the explanation of these three related enigmas is fundamentally the same. They arise from this hypertrophy of finance, its unanchoring from the real economy, in which it becomes dangerous and ceases to perform what should be its higher mission in economic life. Now I turn to the second set of remarks about the financial and economic crisis of 2007 to 2009. And I here proceed in three steps. First, I want to say something about the causation of the crisis. Second, about the shape of the debate about the crisis. And third, about what is missing from this debate, the suppressed themes in the debate about the crisis. So first, the causation of the crisis. Now, I don't propose to outline a general causal explanation of the crisis. I want only to highlight three elements in this causal narrative, because they are related to the ideas that I want to bring out in the subsequent part of my remarks. One element in the causation of the crisis was the dominant regulatory approach to finance in the closing decades of the 20th century. An approach that even today has not been disturbed or replaced. It is what you could call regulatory dualism. It is the distinction between a thickly regulated and a thinly regulated part of finance, the thinly regulated part, including what Danny Roderick labeled shadow banking. The traditional justification for this regulatory dualism is an argument from paternalism. The thinly regulated sector is supposedly inhabited and operated by financial professionals and high net worth individuals who are less needful of this regulation. But the practical consequence has in fact been that everything that was prohibited in the thickly regulated sector was repackaged under a different label and then done in the thinly regulated sector. So regulatory dualism became the prime device for the circumvention of regulation. But to appreciate the significance of regulatory dualism, you have to understand that it operated against the background of the fundamental underlying fact of the financialization of the economy in arrangements that allowed finance to be very detached from the real productive agenda of society and to serve itself under the pretext of serving the real economy. The second element in the causal narrative has to do with the role of credit and debt as a surrogate for real redistribution, and especially for redistribution that instead of being merely corrective through tax and transfer, would result from initiatives influencing the primary distribution of economic advantage. Consider the United States, which was, after all, the epicenter of the crisis of 2007 and 2009. In the second half of the 20th century, the Americans organized a market in mass consumption goods. That was the greatest driver of economic growth in the United States. But mass consumption, or the development of mass consumption, coincided in that same historical period with a violently regressive redistribution of income and wealth. Now, how is it that the Americans managed to reconcile the deepening of mass consumption with the regressive redistribution of income and wealth? In principle, mass consumption would require the popularization of purchasing power. And one way in which they reconcile these two was by replacing the ideal of a property-owning democracy with the reality of a fake credit democracy, made possible in part by the overvaluation of the housing stock as collateral. The third element in the causal narrative has to do with the permissive environment for this buildup of leverage that was provided by the structural imbalances in the world economy. The basic underlying fact is that the United States, and to a lesser extent other countries that suffered that same crisis, stopped producing enough goods and services that the rest of the world wanted. And instead of developing a productivist agenda that today, as I argued before, would require the development of an inclusive form of the knowledge economy, it relied on debt and credit. And it could rely on debt and credit not only because it was the owner of the reserve currency in the world, the dollar, but because of the structural imbalances in the world economy. In other words, the trade surplus and capital surplus countries, beginning with China, helped allow the Americans to live off of credit and debt. And the perverse relation between these two economies, the American and the Chinese, was in the years leading up to the crisis of 2007, 2009, the single greatest motor of growth in the world economy. Now the second step, the shape of the debate about the crisis. Two themes dominated the debate and continue to dominate today the retrospective analysis of the crisis. The first theme is regulation, and the second theme is stimulus. So first, regulation. So the idea is finance ceased to be adequately regulated. And therefore, it must be re-regulated. Now, it's remarkable that despite all of this discourse about re-regulation of finance, even today, the dominant regulatory approach that I described as regulatory dualism has not been challenged and replaced. And in the name of this imperative of re-regulation, a number of reform projects were generated, and I'll now mention 4 of them. So one reform project was the resurrection of the old New Deal arrangements, distinguishing, for example, financial activity that is federally insured deposits from proprietary trading, as under the Glass-Steagall Act in the United States. The second reform project was a new technocratic agenda that would create authority to liquidate and turn around failing financial institutions, especially institutions that were judged to pose systemic risk, quote, too big to fail. The third reform agenda was the agenda of the international financial elite, headquartered in the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, that emphasized the need to upgrade capital adequacy requirements for the banks. And the fourth reform program was the program for the protection of consumers of financial services. including the creation of a consumer protection entity in the United States. What these 4 reform programs have in common is their almost complete lack of structural content. None of them, nor all of them together, change that fundamental relation that I described before as this unmooring of finance from the real economy, in which its hypertrophy is just the reverse side of its disconnection. They were not part of a project to enlist finance more effectively in the service of production. The second theme that dominated the debate about the crisis of 2007-2009 was stimulus. So the answer to the crisis would be stimulus. Now, stimulus would come in 2 forms: monetary stimulus or fiscal stimulus. Very soon, the United States and these other economies in the North Atlantic region discovered the limits of monetary policy. For a long time, easy money has been the residual strategy of economic growth in the United States. But with very low interest rates, easy money turns out to be a device of very limited efficacy in response to a crisis of major dimension. So the federal government in the United States has had no growth strategy. It delegates the growth strategy to the central bank, and all the central bank has is easy money. The other form of stimulus is fiscal stimulus, which in principle should go much further. But there's a problem with fiscal stimulus as an instrument of response to an economic slump of major dimension. And the problem was most clearly illustrated by the much greater crisis of the 1930s. So, to respond to a major slump, fiscal stimulus has to be very large. And as it becomes larger and larger, it meets increasing resistance. Political resistance from the interests of capital, but also resistance created by the derangement of established economic incentives. So, for example, it's often said that countries like the United States and Germany in the 1930s were taken out of depression by a kind of proto-Keynesianism, by stimulus. But it's not true. In fact, they weren't taken out of depression. They had very limited success in responding to depression. They were taken out of depression by the war. The war economy was a remarkable incident, combining massive mobilization of resources with radical institutional innovation in the management of the economy. Entirely different from the peacetime experiments. I'll just mention one revealing fact. The magnitude of governmental procurements in the United States in the first 6 months of 1942 was greater than the total GDP of the United States in 1941. And in just 4 years, from 1941 to 1945, GDP in the United States doubled, in the most sensational episode of economic growth that the United States has ever experienced. Now, it's not to say that stimulus is entirely ineffective. It is necessary and even indispensable, but we have to understand what its true role is. Its true role is first to play for time. To play for time and to create a space for a strategy of economic growth. A strategy of economic growth cannot be reduced to stimulus. it must have structural content. And second, at its most ambitious, the stimulus can be designed to prefigure the strategy of economic growth in its terms, by the way in which it is conceived and implemented. Now I come to the third set of remarks. The third set of remarks is then about what is missing from this conventional discourse about the crisis. The three great themes that have been suppressed, and they're intimately related to the elements that I emphasized in my first set of remarks about the causation of the crisis. So the first theme that is suppressed in the conventional discourse is the relation of regulation to reorganization. What matters is the change of the relation of finance to the real economy. That finance become a good servant rather than a bad master. So a threshold requirement is finally to cast aside regulatory dualism. But then to go on to a series of initiatives that would begin to reshape the relation of finance to the real economy, both negative and positive. On the negative side, to discourage or even prohibit financial activity that has no plausible relation to the expansion of output or the enhancement of productivity. So, for example, futures contracts have a clearly originated in the commodities markets, where they perform a function of liquidity. But it's not clear that they have any valid function in equities markets, where they serve as a kind of gambling. Now, the problem is not financial speculation per se. Financial speculation is useful to develop information and organize risk. The problem is the disconnection of the speculative element in finance from real economic activity. And on the affirmative side, a series of institutional innovations or experiments that would tighten the link of finance to the real economy. For example, creating between the state and the firms an intermediate level of support centers that would tap the dormant productive potential of a vast amount of capital in the pension systems of the world, and do the undone work of private venture capital, investing in the creation of new assets in new ways. The second suppressed theme in the conventional debate about the crisis and recovery is the relation of redistribution to recovery. And the redistribution that is most valuable is the redistribution resulting from initiatives that change the original distribution of economic advantage, rather than simply trying to correct the inequalities of the market by retrospective and compensatory tax and transfer. And there are two crucial elements in such a program, one of which we have discussed at length and the other not. The element that we have discussed is the development of an inclusive form of the most advanced practice of production, today the knowledge economy, through a series of institutional and educational initiatives. And the element that we have not discussed is the relation of labor to capital. Not just labor in the organized part of the labor market, but also what is increasingly important in these contemporary economies, labor consigned to precarious employment. Under the banner of flexibility, an increasing part of the labor force is thrown into radical economic insecurity, with consequences that inhibit the dynamic of economic innovation. It would be necessary to create a legal regime designed to organize, represent, and protect precarious labor. For example, by affirming a principle of price neutrality, labor that is temporary or conditional, that is unstable, must be remunerated at least the same threshold of the equivalent form of stable labor. The third suppressed element in the debate about the crisis that I just described has to do with the structural imbalances in the world economy. So what happened was this. Each major economy in the world, in the run-up to the crisis of 2007 and 2009, used the structural imbalances in the world economy as a way of evading the task of internal structural transformation. So in principle, there should be no contradiction between growth oriented to export and growth based on the deepening of the domestic market. But in fact, the relation to the world economy was used as a way of escaping the work of internal transformation. China would need to deepen its internal market. But the deepening of the internal market is no mere accounting exercise. It requires massive redistribution among regions, classes, and sectors that is politically dangerous, that has to be organized and has to be debated. And so the way out, the escape, was to grow through the export orientation, exporting the trade and capital surpluses to the deficit countries, beginning with the United States. The United States, on its side, would have to have a productivist project. And today, the productivist project couldn't consist simply in buying a few more years for declining mass production industry. It would have to consist in the advancement of a deepened and disseminated form of the knowledge economy, a very ambitious task, which the Americans escaped during this historical period by relying on debt and credit in the permissive environment of these structural imbalances in the world economy. Now I summarize the general character of this whole discussion. The crisis presents always, any crisis, any breakdown, an opportunity for transformation. The dominant attitude to the crisis has been that it is a shadow, an interruption, that we want to make pass so that we can get back to business as usual. But in fact, the crisis is the opportunity that history gives us to achieve structural change. However, to recognize that opportunity, to seize that opportunity, we need ideas. And the ideas that we need are not widely available in the world. Yes.
So I feel like in this discussion, there's an elephant in the room that's not being talked about.
Yes.
And I think to what extent do you think the morality, the lack of morality in the financial profession, or rather the caricaturing of that profession as, so let me restart this comment. So when we today say banker, we don't think of Mother Teresa. We think of the opposite of the direct opposite of that. And I think, and we have caricatures like the Wolf of Wall Street, or
Yes.
et cetera, et cetera. And I think a huge part of the crisis, the political crisis that has come out of the economic crisis, is the fact that people feel like they have been asked to take on the burden of this class of basically people with decadent lifestyles who come from, good schools that perhaps didn't provide them the moral education that would have been necessary for a moral financial system. And I feel like in
in our discussion today, there hasn't really been a tapping into that moral aspect that has sort of really stirred the populism of the modern day. So could you please comment on perhaps why?
Well, I think so. Yes, I will. And I think though we should distinguish between two interpretations of the moral impulse, a narrower one and a broader one. And I believe it is a mistake to let the narrower one crowd the broader one out. So the narrower one is that it's a problem of the ethics of the financial professionals. So that if they were more ethical, none of this would happen. I don't think that's reasonable. I think that's an entirely secondary part of the picture. The capital markets, just like any part of the market economy, does not create its own presuppositions, its own institutional arrangements, its own rules. The presuppositions of the market, including of the capital market, are created outside of the market, in politics and in thought, and then translated into law. That's not a creation of the market, and the market isn't responsible for that. The market is dealt a hand of cards, and it plays those cards. And the question is, what should the hand of cards be? That's the fundamental question. And but there's the question of moral vision appears in a larger dimension. Now, I think this is actually a very important point that you raise, and it is omnipresent. It appears in many forms, because in a situation like the one in which we find ourselves, in which there is a deficit of structural initiative and structural imagination, there is the temptation to replace the transformative impulse by a pietistic impulse. So the managers of corporate enterprises should have social responsibility. The financiers should be ethical, and so on and so forth. It won't change anything fundamental. It's a veil. It's an illusion that is disguising what is really important. What is really important is structural insight informing structural change. Yes.
I have a problem about the way getting out of it, because from what I understand, from what I learned and what I heard you explain now, and I saw a glimpse of that in Danny's presentation, the financial sphere is like the alien in the movie.
It's like the which?
The alien. It's like a parasite. Yeah. It sits on a body, and it lives out of it. But in the end, it takes over the body. When you look at the stock market and the derivative markets, according to the real markets, you see there is a change in magnitude that you can't imagine. And the problem that I see is, if I try to come to a result of making the financial market start working for the real people, for the society, and for the real economy, I need to deal politically with the most powerful elite in the world. Just think about politicians. They buy everyone. Even Obama, which was a great symbol for many people, was financed by George Soros in his beginning. So I'm asking myself, and the amounts of money that those institutions have today, you can't compare them with those of unions and of states, even states. So how can I make the transition to have a political power that can take such a big plan if they are buying all the politicians for the last 40 years?
Well, but I'm not sure how to interpret this. So after the crisis in Europe, in the European electoral cycles, immediately after that crisis, the theme of the relation of finance to the real economy became a popular theme. For example, in the French presidential election, finance, and it's not you to turn the banks into villains. No one likes financiers, right? It's not that it's politically difficult to attack them. Even if behind the curtain they're financing the politicians, it's easy to attack them. Now, what was remarkable is that despite this emphasis on the critique of financialization and the financiers, almost nothing was proposed of consequence. You know what the most popular proposal was? It was the Tobin tax. It was ridiculous to throw sand into the wheels of finance. There were no structural proposals, even though they had developed this discourse. So explain that to me. It's a mystery. But clearly, at least one element of that mystery is this complete vacuum of a programmatic insight into alternatives. That's clearly not a sufficient explanation, but it's one element in this phenomenon.
If I can,
He's saying it's not ideas that matter. It says that it's just a.
I understand that was a discussion we had before, but I said against that. In fact, there were many politicians who thought that it was in their interest to attack finance.
But you had ideas in your presentation. You said, let's have regulation that differentiates between financial speculation that serves the real economy and those that doesn't. And if I understood you right, you said commodity futures is okay, but financial forwards is not okay.
Yes.
That's one idea. We can discuss it. You said, let's set up these intermediate institutions that are going to leverage, let's say, pension fund resources
Put them in diversified portfolios of investment in emerging enterprise. Yes.
Essentially acting like a kind of a public
investment vehicle.
venture fund,
Yes.
like to finance activities in the knowledge
or use
economy.
The sovereign wealth funds or so.
So these are ideas, and why do you think that they don't get any traction?
I think the answer to that question is not obvious, and I don't believe that the simple answer to that question is that the financial interests are so powerful that they don't allow such ideas. I don't believe that, because I think that in all of these economies there is a latent coalition of productivist interests, of producers and workers, as opposed to simply the interests of rentiers and consumers. But the whole character of the politics of these advanced societies since the Second World War, coming from the social democratic settlements, has been to abdicate any attempt to reshape the institutional arrangements of the state and of production. So that's the horizon that defines the rules. And I don't think we can understand the persistence of that horizon simply as a matter of the power of these tangible financial interests, because there are many countervailing interests. Now, the countervailing interests would have to be articulated, so there would have to be simultaneously an intellectual construction and a political construction going beyond the limits of this institutionally conservative social democracy. And I'm not minimizing the difficulty of that task. I just don't think that it can be understood as a simple story about overwhelming interests, overwhelming financial interests. Yes.
So I was wondering about the wider context of like financial innovation and like whether it's advantageous or leads to like excessive results. And if you look, for instance, like interest was opposed and partially is opposed by major religion, yet it's a financial product. And like later on, we had like equities and insurance being invented, and sometimes has led to like bubbles and horrible social consequences. Yet nowadays, we wouldn't say that any of these products is like overall like harmful to society, or at least it's not like a discussion.
Correct.
So how do we know that neo-financial products are like harmful or
Well, we have to look at the facts of the matter, at the details, as in the example I gave about options contracts. So sometimes they are and sometimes they aren't, and sometimes it's doubtful. But it seems to me that although this is not a discussion in which there are easy answers, it is a discussion to which the facts of the matter apply. So the problem, so it's not the case that we've tried to have that discussion and we failed in the discussion because it's too murky. That's not what's happened. What's happened on the whole is that we haven't had that discussion. We haven't had it to start with. And so that's the argument for the idea element. Now, it's unreasonable to expect that discussion would come from the financiers themselves. They can be useful. And there are progressive financiers, or people who make a lot of money and then want to do something else and go into politics and so forth, and betray their own class. There are plenty of those. But all of this has to be organized intellectually and politically. Yes?
To what extent are academics to blame for this lack of new ideas?
Well, of course they're to blame. So don't ask me to say that they're not to blame, but they're not the only ones to blame. So I think, so one of the continuing themes here in this course is the role of the dominant ideas, including the dominant ideas in economics, in shaping this situation.
But I mean, if I can get in on there and just connect it with the previous discussion on what's productive finance and what's finance that's disconnected from production. I think it would be fair to say that on this particular question of which kind of financial derivatives or financial contracts serve a real purpose in the economy and which doesn't, on that area, actually, there is a very large literature in the economics.
Yes.
So it's not fair to say that academics or economists or financial professionals or regulators have not engaged with that question.
Correct. But I interpreted this comment as not being about that narrow point.
No, right. No. And on the broader issue, I agree with. I'm going to agree with you, but by making a distinction, which is to say, the reason that I think this particular question has been engaged by academics and economists is because it's been perceived as largely as a prudential question. That is, that if you go back to the list of things that have been done after the crisis, they're mostly with respect to strengthening the prudential aspects of the regime, which is to minimize the risk of another crisis. So the question about ensuring that that consumers are better are protected from financial fraud, or separating out proprietary trading from other investments, sort of ensuring that there are living wills and that large institutions can be intervened in. Those kinds of things that have been the predominantly, or the capital adequacy standard, those which have been the predominantly aspects of the regime where there's been some fixes, they're all targeted at reducing risk of financial crisis. They all have to do with just the prudential aspect. And I think maybe to some extent that's natural because we're coming right after the crisis and attention is focused on how can we reduce the likelihood of another such crisis. Where we have not engaged, where I think you're right that there has not been significant discussion on, is precisely this question of a much more constructive or reconstructive or reorganizational aspect of finance and connecting it with the real economy. And that's where I think ideas such as yours, where actually leveraging public pension funds or other public resources or other kinds of sources of savings more directly for the knowledge economy using sort of quasi-public venture funds and things of that kind. And that hasn't gotten much airtime and much discussion. Yes. And there, I think you're right that there's a lot of organizational, institutional imagination that's missing. But I mean, to turn it on its back, I think, and maybe we don't have time to discuss it, but would you say that that in turn comes with certain amounts of risk, that there's a prudential price to pay?
But I want to go in another direction in this last minute and circle back to the beginning of my remarks. So many of these interventions now of yours have raised this question of under what circumstances is this reshaping of the relation of finance to the real economy more or less likely to take place? And I think it's unlikely to take place unless it takes place in the context of a larger economic project, going back to what I described as the first major cause of economic instability, which was this lack of equivalence between supply and demand. And let me now try another take at that. So Henry Ford famously quipped, I like to pay my workers well so they can buy my cars. Now, of course, it was a joke, because they could use the money to buy the cars of his competitors or to buy something other than cars. But the joke contains the idea of a kind of contract in which capital agrees to pay more to labor, and labor in turn agrees to buy the products and services of capital. That would be what I'm calling this continuous breakthrough on the demand side and the supply side of the economy. Now, it turns out that there is no contractual solution to that thought, to that problem. And that's why Ford's remark is just a joke. There's no contractual solution. There's only an institutional solution. And the theme that we discussed before of the deepening and dissemination of the knowledge economy is an instance of that idea of an institutional solution. So my answer is the reshaping of the relation of finance to the real economy is likely to take place only in the context of some broader project that is responsive to that goal. And unless there is such a broader project, it is unlikely to take place. We're out of time. What? Yes. That's right. Next week, so 2 weeks from today.